it was the fact that, like, for a very long time, I felt really uncomfortable with the idea of telling my story in a dramatized way. Like, it's also the story about how a girl went to Italy and got murdered. People have always, like,
And that girl was Meredith Kercher.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel that my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. Have you watched that interview that Gwyneth Paltrow did with Amanda Knox? Let me ask you a question. In the first 20 minutes, how many times do you think Meredith Kercher's name, the victim in the story, the real victim in the story, the person around which all of this brouhaha sort of centers, how many times do you think her name is mentioned in the first 20 minutes of this interview? In Amanda Knox's book, Meredith Kercher is mentioned about 500 times. Again, let me ask you the question. How many times is Meredith Kercher's name mentioned in this interview? And we'll deal with the answer to that at the end of this analysis. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, if you're new to the channel, I've written, 6 books on the Amanda Knox case. I've also visited Perugia. I've walked the route from the villa to Solicito's home, also to Rudy Godet, who lives just around the corner from Solicito, and also walked around the rest of Perugia just to get a feel for the fabric of that particular case. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, meaningful, interesting, important, factual, authentic, please do hit the thanks button and let's get started.
people have always, like, tried to compare us and sort of, like, pit us against each other in this horrific way when we're both victims of, like, the same circumstances. Like, and
People have always tried to compare us. Compare who? Sort of pit us against each other. Pit who against who? And we're both victims. Well, who's the other person? It's Meredith Kercher. Say her name, Amanda. Say the name of the true victim in your story. And no, the circumstances aren't the same. Meredith Kercher was brutally murdered. You were not. Meredith Kercher lost her life. You have made a career out of your experience. As a student of the Amanda Knox case, I've watched countless interviews, not just watched them, analyzed them, slowed them down, played them over and over again. And I've done that with the first few lines, probably, I think it is the first 2 minutes of this interview. But how I first came across it was the first few lines highlighted in the Daily Mail's embedded clip of this interview. Now, do you know what I notice? While she's waving her hands, she lifts both hands and uses them to role-play how herself and her friend is Meredith Kercher, are pitted against each other. There's a moment at around 135, 136 where she's saying, we're both victims of, and just before she says the same circumstances, right? We're both victims of the same circumstances. There's a little micro expression that leaks out. I've seen it before, but let's go to that right now.
of, like, the same circumstances, like,
It's a few more seconds back. It's just before 136.
and sort of, like, pit us against each other in this horrific way when we're both victims of, like, the same circumstances. Like, and
Let's watch that again at half speed and see if you notice what I'm getting at.
in this horrific way when we're both victims of, like, the same circumstances. Like, and I just didn't like the idea.
There are actually 2 things there I want you to notice, but let's deal with the first one. And let's play it again, this time at 0.25 speed.
Each other in this horrific way when we're both victims of, like, the same circumstances.
Did you catch that? And here is the second one, just after that.
Like,
It's very subtle, very fleeting. It's blink and you'll miss it. But there's the slightest flicker of a smile. I have tried to screen grab it, but you really have to watch it in context in the video version where there's movement. Now, comparing both images, they are both with the timestamp of 1:36. You may notice Knox's fingers and the microphone are different. That tells you it's not the same screen grab. The other thing that's different is her mouth, in particular the corners of her mouth. As I say, it's subtle. Now let me finish my point. In the context of saying something like this,
when we're both victims of like the same circumstances, like
in order to understand what's going on here, you've got to put yourself psychologically into the interviewee's shoes. What is happening here? Well, she's intuiting the circumstances of Meredith Kercher. I mean, in that pause where she's saying, we're both, and then there's a flicker of an internal projector turning on, a flashback possibly, a memory probably of Meredith, and in this most crucial and terrible of recountings, the slightest smile, and all of these dramatic and distracting hand gestures. By the way, at the end of it, this is the part that's also easy to miss, at the end of that statement, she pauses, is actually unable to speak, and again, look at her hand gestures, they gesture towards her throat, and she kind of gulps audibly. And that is where Meredith Kercher was murdered, where she was injured, where the knives entered her body, in her throat, on both sides of it as well. Amanda Knox is quite eloquent and quite well educated, but it's hard to miss the irony and contradiction where she says, completely with a straight face, that her reservations in making a dramatization of herself was, well, I don't know what her reasons were, nor frankly do I care, but the bottom line was she was saying how uncomfortable she was with the idea.
I felt really uncomfortable with the idea of telling my story in a dramatized way.
Did you know that in September 2011, Amanda Knox wrote a video script for a band, and the band decided to use it for their song The Mistral Blows? In this music video, which came out something like 9 years ago, which was scripted by Amanda Knox, you see scenes of someone who looks like Amanda Knox in a prison situation. And all of this was written and scripted while Amanda was still going through that whole legal process. She was in the middle of it.
I felt really uncomfortable with the idea of telling my story in a dramatized way.
In John Verlaine's book, A Death in Italy, he also talks about Amanda Knox writing a fictional story while she was in prison. I think someone also mentioned that she'd written some kind of blog post that involved some sort of violent act. This is before the crime had happened. So she was quite interested in storytelling and fiction. But the point is, when she says, I didn't feel comfortable telling my story in a dramatized way, that's exactly what got her into trouble in the first place. She told a story, pretty imaginative, pretty graphic, in which she saw and heard her boss killing Meredith, and this led to his arrest. This is at the ground zero of the investigation of this case. Do you guys need me to retell that story that she told, or do you know what I'm talking about?
That, like, for a very long time, I felt really uncomfortable with the idea of telling my story in a dramatized way.
But if you're not sure, I'll put a link to that in the description. At the police station, she was variously quoted as saying to one of Meredith's friends that she fucking bled to death. That's according to author John Verlaine. This is an excerpt from the article. I actually have Verlaine's book right here, right beside my keyboard. Meanwhile, in Knox's own narrative, as you would expect, she sketches this exchange slightly differently and in a slightly modified, minimized form. Still worked up, I turned around and gaped. How could she not have suffered, I said. She got her fucking throat slit. Fucking bastards. I was angry and blunt. Meanwhile,
it was the fact that, like, for a very long time, I felt really uncomfortable with the idea of telling my story in a dramatized way.
Earlier this year, Knox actually said something interesting on former newspaper editor Andy Coulson's podcast, Crisis, What Crisis? Coulson had highlighted a phrase in her new book which says, I wouldn't wish my wrongful conviction on anyone, but nor would I trade it for the world. Knox expanded further by quoting ancient Roman philosopher Seneca as she replied, I am who I am today because of what I went through. And so is Meredith Kercher. She is who she is because of what she went through. dead, buried in a cemetery in Croydon, London, since 2007. Not to put too fine a point on it, but what Meredith went through is far, far, far worse than what Knox went through, and far worse than most people go through, and that is including murder victims.
It was the fact that, like, for a very long time, I felt really uncomfortable with the idea of telling my story in a dramatized way.
But she's more than comfortable now. Knox's PR campaign to promote her Hulu series is everywhere. I've been getting multiple daily notifications, Google alerts every day for months now. Meanwhile, Knox herself couldn't be more behind the dramatization, more comfortable than she is right now. This is her current background image on her X profile. But let's get back to Meredith Kercher. On a scale of murder victims I've covered, the suffering Kercher suffered is about the worst I've ever come across. Meredith Kercher didn't bleed to death. She drowned in her own blood, because after being stabbed in her throat from both sides, blood poured into her lungs while she was being subdued. The autopsy showed that her lungs were full of blood, and the area around her body showed like films of arterial spray. Now, if what I'm saying is a surprise to you, think about the hours and hours and hours that Knox has spoken about her story, and yet she never mentions this. She never mentions Meredith's suffering. The recent murder of the Ukrainian girl in the subway, Irina Zarutska, should disturb you. But can you imagine any of the passengers, any of those sitting next to her, having the temerity to make the story about them, writing books, and then claiming...
People have always tried to compare us and sort of pit us against each other in this horrific way when we're both victims of the same circumstances. And I just didn't like the idea of...
Really, were those around Irina victims of the same circumstances? How can Amanda Knox really compare a prison term she served for a crime she did commit, slander? I mean, that's why she went to prison. That's why she can't sue for wrongful conviction. That's why she isn't due compensation for restitution. She wasn't sent to prison for a crime she didn't commit. She was sent to prison for a crime she did commit. Slander, right? Because she did slander someone else and ruined his life. He suffered more than Amanda Knox as well. He lost his business and left the country with his family. And he even had children. How can she compare prison term she served 4 years to the ghastly murder that's 17 years ago and counting? And each year is another year Meredith is dead and Amanda isn't. Each year is another year Meredith is dead and Amanda is alive. How is it the same? Do you know that right now no one is in prison for Kercher's murder? When Knox went to revisit her story in Italy, did she ever think to revisit her murdered roommate, whose story she has used as a foundation for the rest of her life? Or to revisit Lumumba? Did she ever pay her respects to Meredith? Does she? In her interview with Paltrow, I only listened to the first 4 minutes. Is Meredith Kercher's name ever mentioned? But I want to challenge you to listen to the whole video. I think it's an hour, just over an hour, and count the number of times Meredith Kercher's name is mentioned. And then I think one's got to ask the question, shouldn't the interviewer have remembered Meredith, brought her up, thought a bit more critically about the interview she's conducting? What do you think? Let me know in the comments. I did post a postscript on Patreon where I said, basically gave advice. So someone who doesn't know this case very well, what should they do? Where should they start? And by the way, it's not that you should read one of my books. So if you're interested in that, I'll put a link to that post in the description as well. Also, don't forget to read the translated version of what Knox apparently said, implicating Patrick Lumumba. I'll put a link to that in the description. Well, I'm not going to take it further than that. I will be resuming my analysis of the Hulu series. We're still very early in episode 1, so look out for that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.